Tonight on Province Wide. Feeling good about being Canadian? But what is our national identity?
The Canadian identity to me is diversity. It's just a great place where everybody gets on.
And is there a quintessential Canadian symbol?
The beaver.
The beaver.
Yep.
We investigate the myths and realities of what it means to be Canadian. It was a rocky session for both Ottawa and Queen's Park. A political analyst shakes out the drama and what lies ahead. And ready to curl up with a good book this summer? See what these bookstore owners are picking as their top reads.
From CTV News, this is Province Wide. Here now, CTV's Diane Vernile.
Good evening and welcome to Province Wide. Parades, barbecues, and fireworks are some of the ways Canadians are celebrating Canada Day. Coast to coast, it's an outpouring of national pride. But still, for many, there's the question of identity. With 1 out of every 6 of us born outside this country, in 2012, we're asking, what does it mean to be Canadian?
It's a day that Canadians swell with pride.
Canada rocks!
Every year, hundreds of thousands make the trek to Ottawa to celebrate Canada's birthday in the nation's capital, waving flags and feeling good about being Canadian. But there's still that elusive question with no clear answer, even after 145 years of nationhood. What exactly does it mean to be Canadian? On the street, we heard all sorts of answers.
The Canadian identity to me is diversity. As an immigrant to Canada in 1981, I've been able to assimilate into the Canadian culture very easily. It's just a great place where everybody gets on well together and really integrates, and I think that's something quite rare and quite special.
You know, I look at us and think that we've got so many things to be thankful for, healthcare, and honestly, there's just so many things.
A few years ago, this beer commercial guy tried to explain it.
I speak English and French, not American, and I pronounce it about, not about. I can proudly sew my country's flag on my backpack. I believe in peacekeeping, not policing. Diversity, not assimilation. And that the beaver is a truly proud and noble animal.
And this Canadian agrees it's our greatest symbol.
The beaver.
The beaver.
Yep.
Why the beaver?
Because it's on our nickel.
Not so fast, says this citizen.
Kind of thinking the beaver, but really, what does the beaver do for us? He's cute.
I guess I would say the Mountie.
The Mountie?
Yeah.
Why did you pick the Mountie?
Well, I mean, I think the Mounties come to symbolize a lot of sort of Canada's, peacekeeping identity.
What is the quintessential Canadian symbol?
The maple leaf, obviously.
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 These two were headed for breakfast and gave this answer.
What is the great Canadian symbol?
Bacon.
Bacon.
I like bacon.
I'll stick with the food theme and I'll go with maple syrup.
But maybe being Canadian is what we can all agree on, like how great it feels to win at our national sport.
Sidney Crosby, the golden goal!
Well, one person who's given a great deal of thought on what it means to be Canadian is Dr. Kevin Spooner, who teaches on Canadian identities and cultures at Wilfrid Laurier University. So there is the reality and the myth of what it means to be Canadian. Let's start with the myth. What are we not, despite perceptions?
Well, I think that that's a really good question. I think that we think of ourselves as being a very diverse and very multicultural nation, and there's both an element of truth and an element of myth in that, in the sense that demographically we are a very multicultural nation, we are very diverse, and that's a trend that's only continuing and going to continue in the future. 20% of Canadians right now in 2006 were foreign born, so from outside the country, and that's going to only increase in the decade ahead. So we are a very diverse society. We're not always a welcoming society, and I think Canadians like to think that we're a very welcoming society to newcomers and to people of diverse backgrounds, and that's not always the case.
How are we not welcoming people? Because we think of ourselves as being friendly and tolerant.
We do. We absolutely think of ourselves as being friendly and tolerant, and yet, evidence shows that there is racism, and newcomers in particular, new immigrants face incredible racism, particularly in terms of entering the workforce, and they typically earn much less than Canadians do, even when we correct for things like education and language language and those things. So there's some evidence for sure that within Canadian society we like to think we're welcoming, and yet we're not always so tolerant and welcoming.
Okay, so that's the myth. What is the reality? Is it mainly that we are English, French, with a growing multicultural population?
There is some resonance of that still today. I mean, I think that the notion of English and French Canada comes from the 1960s, the late 60s, when the Royal Commission on Biculturalism and Bilingualism was really addressing this question. But even in the 60s, they began to recognize that that doesn't tell the whole story, that in fact Canada, even then, was a multicultural nation, was becoming more multicultural. And we also, you know, in the 1960s left out Indigenous people, and that's an incredibly fast-growing segment of the Canadian population. So it's more complex than English and French. It is English, French, multicultural, and Indigenous.
Are there distinct characteristics? I mean, when you think about Americans or Italians or the Chinese, you know what they're all about. What are we all about?
That's the million-dollar question, Diane. If I had an answer to that, I don't think that we can easily say that there are, you know, a certain set of Canadian characteristics that are uniquely Canadian. That said, I think that there probably are some elements, like a sense of community. There's a strong sense, I think, in Canadians that we need to care for one another. We're not as individualistic a society as some other countries, and there's the sense that we need to care for one another. We're a more caring society, and often Canadians will identify themselves that way. Healthcare is the sort of classic example of this. Why do Canadians hold healthcare so dear to their identity? And I think it's partly related to this aspect of our political culture that places emphasis on community over the individual.
Does the rest of the world see us that way still too? We're the nice guys?
Well, in terms of global reputation, I think that yes, that's true. For the most part, particularly over the past number of years, we've tended to fare fairly well on opinion polls that rank countries in the world. We tend to have a good reputation around the world, largely I think on a peacekeeping legacy that might be more myth than reality now in terms of the role that our military has played more recently in the world. So there's an element of myth that even goes along with that. But I think that for the most part, we do tend to have a reasonably good reputation around the world.
Well, when I was asking people this week, you know, what does it mean to be Canadian? Many of them said, well, we're not American. So, yeah. You know, I think that we have this attitude where we put down Americans, and yet when Americans mention us on a TV show, we get so excited. So talk to me about that difference.
Yeah, and I tell my students that when I'm teaching in Canadian studies that Canada is a complicated, messy country, and part of the messiness comes from our relationship with the United States. And it's interesting, you know, that people will identify Canada as not being the United States. Canadians are not Americans. You know, we'd like to emphasize the fact that we're not Americans. We don't want to be mistaken for Americans. And yet we do have lots of similarities. There's lots of overlap between Canada and the United States in terms of attitudes and values. But we don't like to see ourselves that way. We have an inferiority complex and a superiority complex at the same time. We like to feel superior to them. And then at the same time, we have this inferiority complex that when they do take notice of us, we feel really happy and proud of the fact that they are noticing us.
What is it that unites us? Is it hockey? Is it Tim Hortons?
Well, you know, I was in Savannah, Georgia, and I was checking into the airport with a colleague a number of years ago, and as we checked in, the person at the check-in counter said to us, well, we asked, are we going to be able to find coffee after we check in? And she said, yes, you'll find coffee, in a Georgian accent, she said this, but you won't find Tim Hortons. So I think Tim Hortons, to some degree, does define who we are. I think hockey does define who we are. I mean, those are the popular images and conceptions of Canadians, not only that we have of ourselves, but clearly that the rest of the world has of us.
Well, Kevin Spooner, thank you for bringing us your insights today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Still ahead, backroom deals that almost went bust and a surprising turn in opinion polls for one party. A political insider sizes up raucous sessions and what lies ahead. That's coming up on Province Wide.